Prologue. The shores of Gennesaret. The Sea of Galilee, known to the locals as Lake Gennesaret, was not a quiet body of water. It was a basin of unpredictable temperament, where sudden squalls could turn glass-like waters into a churning cauldron of whitecaps in mere minutes. Yet, for the men of Capernaum, it was life. It was the source of their sustenance, the foundation of their trade, and the silent witness to their generations of labor. In this bustling fishing village, nestled on the northern shore of the sea, lived men forged by salt, sun, and sweat. Among them were two pairs of brothers, Simon and Andrew, and James and John, the sons of Zebedee. They were not wealthy men, nor were they scholars of the law. They were rough-hewn, their hands heavily calloused from years of hauling heavy linen nets, their faces weathered by the harsh Levantine sun. For weeks, whispers had drifted through the marketplaces and alleys of Capernaum. Rumors of a carpenter from Nazareth, a man named Jesus. Some called him a prophet. Others whispered he might be the long-awaited Messiah. He spoke with an authority that astounded the learned scribes, and tales of his healing touch preceded his arrival. But to the fishermen, consumed by the crushing weight of Roman taxes and the daily grind of survival, rumors were merely wind. They needed fish. They needed a catch to feed their families. This is the story of a morning that began with the bitter taste of failure, only to culminate in a calling that would alter the course of human history. Chapter 1. The Night of Empty Nets. The water was ink-black, reflecting only the scattered diamonds of the starry expanse above. Simon, a man of impulsive passion and undeniable stubbornness, wiped the sea spray from his eyes. His muscles burned with a familiar, dull ache. Beside him, his brother Andrew worked in rhythmic silence, his shoulders straining against the weight of the heavy dragnet. Again, Simon grunted, his voice hoarse. They cast the nets out into the dark waters, the weights splashing softly as they sank into the depths. For hours they had followed this routine. Row to a new spot, cast the net, wait, and heave it back into the boat. And for hours, the result had been the same, a dripping mound of empty hemp. Not a single tilapia, not a single sardine. A stone's throw away, the boat belonging to Zebedee rocked gently on the swells. James and John were experiencing the exact same misfortune. The sea had locked its doors to them tonight. As the first hints of purple and bruised orange began to bleed into the eastern horizon, signifying the approaching dawn, the harsh reality settled over Simon. An empty boat meant an empty purse. The tax collectors at the toll booth in Capernaum would not care about the unpredictable nature of fish. With a heavy sigh that carried across the quiet water, Simon signaled to Andrew. "Pull them in. We're done." They rowed back to the pebbled shore of Capernaum in defeated silence. The morning light revealed their exhaustion. Pulling their boats onto the damp shore, the brothers began the tedious, agonizingly dull task of washing their nets. They had to remove the silt, weeds, and debris, lest the expensive fibers rot before the next night's toil. Chapter 2. The Teacher on the Sand. As the sun climbed higher, casting a brilliant golden glare across the water, the quiet morning was shattered by the sound of approaching multitude. A massive crowd was pressing down the narrow streets of Capernaum, spilling out onto the shoreline. At the center of the throng was Jesus of Nazareth. People were pushing against one another, desperate to hear his words, to touch the hem of his garment, to present their sick and afflicted. The sheer volume of the crowd was overwhelming, backing Jesus dangerously close to the water's edge. Simon paused his net washing, the wet hemp dripping from his hands. He watched the rabbi. There was a profound calmness about the man, a stark contrast to the frantic energy of the desperate crowd pressing against him. Jesus turned and noticed the two boats resting on the shore, the fishermen nearby tending their nets. He stepped into Simon's boat. "Simon," Jesus said, his voice carrying clearly over the din of the crowd, "put out a little from the land." Simon hesitated for a fraction of a second. He was bone-tired, frustrated, and in no mood to entertain a traveling preacher. Yet there was something compelling in the request, not a demand but an invitation. Simon nodded, dropping his nets, and stepped into the boat. He pushed the heavy wooden hull off the gravel, wading into the shallows until the boat drifted a few yards from the shore. He dropped the anchor stone. Jesus sat down in the boat, the traditional posture of a Jewish teacher, and began to speak to the crowds gathered on the natural amphitheater of the sloping beach. Simon sat quietly at the stern, a captive audience. As he listened, the irritation of the night's failure began to recede. The words Jesus spoke were not like the dry, repetitive recitations of the Pharisees. They were words of life, of a kingdom drawing near, spoken with a breathtaking, divine authority. Chapter 3. Into the Deep. When Jesus had finished speaking, a reverent hush fell over the massive crowd. The air felt charged, thick with the weight of the truths just spoken. Jesus turned away from the multitude on the shore and looked directly at Simon. "Put out into deep water," Jesus instructed, "and let down the nets for a catch." Simon stared at him. The request was, by all accounts of a seasoned fisherman, entirely absurd. The fisherman's logic. Time of day. Fish in the Sea of Galilee were caught at night when they came to the surface to feed. During the heat of the day, they retreated to the depths where nets could not reach them. The equipment, they had just painstakingly washed the nets. Casting them now meant dirtying them all over again. The experience. Simon was the professional. Jesus was a carpenter. Simon's pride bristled. "Master," he replied, a hint of exasperation leaking into his voice, "we've worked hard all night and haven't caught anything." He looked at the empty deck, then at his exhausted brother Andrew, and finally back at Jesus. The carpenter's eyes held no challenge, only a serene, unwavering expectation. The silence stretched. Simon, the proud master of a ship, felt his resistance crumble against the quiet authority of the man sitting before him. "But because you say so," Simon surrendered, his voice dropping to a humble murmur, "I will let down the nets." He hauled up the anchor. Together with Andrew, they rowed the boat away from the safety of the shallows, pushing out toward the deep, dark center of the lake. Chapter 4. The Breaking Nets. They reached the deep water. The sun was beating down, glaring off the surface. Simon grabbed the heavy folds of the freshly washed net and, with a practiced twist of his torso, flung it wide. The weights carried it down into the dark blue water. They waited. Simon expected nothing but the familiar, disheartening slack of empty ropes. But as he grabbed the hauling line to pull it back, the rope went instantly, terrifyingly taut. It wasn't just heavy, it was violently jerking, alive with kinetic energy. The muscles in Simon's forearms bulged as he tried to hold on. The boat lurched dangerously to one side. "Andrew, help me!" Simon shouted over the sudden thrashing of the water. Together, they strained against the rope. Looking over the side, Simon's breath caught in his throat. The water was boiling with fish. Thousands of silver scales flashed in the sunlight. The net was so full that the thick hemp fibers began to groan and snap under the immense pressure. The catch was too massive. Simon frantically waved his arms toward the shore, whistling sharply to their partners. "James! John! Bring the other boat! Hurry!" Zebedee's sons abandoned their work on the beach, pushing their boat into the water and rowing furiously toward Simon and Andrew. When they arrived, the sight left them speechless. Working together, the four men began the Herculean task of hauling the massive, writhing catch into the boats. They filled Simon's boat. Then they filled the boat of James and John. The sheer volume of fish was unprecedented, defying all natural explanation. The weight was so immense that water began to lap over the gunwales of both vessels. The boats were sinking under the weight of the miraculous blessing. Chapter 5. The Fear of the Holy. As the boats sat dangerously low in the water, filled to the brim with flopping, silver fish, a profound shift occurred in Simon. He didn't see the fortune lying at his feet. He didn't calculate the money this catch would bring in the market. The economic miracle vanished from his mind, entirely eclipsed by a sudden, terrifying realization of who was sitting in his boat. This was no ordinary teacher. The man who commanded the fish of the sea was a master of creation itself. Suddenly acutely aware of his own darkness, his pride, his doubts, and his sins, Simon felt completely undone. The presence of absolute holiness was blinding, and it magnified his own unworthiness. Ignoring the water sloshing around his ankles and the fortune surrounding him, Simon fell to his knees, weaving his way through the pile of fish until he collapsed at Jesus' feet. "Go away from me, Lord," Simon cried out, his voice trembling with deep fear and reverence. "I am a sinful man." He dared not look up. He felt the terrifying vulnerability of being completely known and utterly exposed before the divine. Andrew, James, and John stood frozen in their own boat, gripped by the same profound, holy terror. They had witnessed a tearing of the veil between heaven and earth. Jesus looked down at the rugged, weeping fisherman. There was no condemnation in his eyes, only deep compassion and purpose. He reached out, perhaps placing a hand on Simon's shaking shoulder. "Don't be afraid," Jesus spoke, his voice a steady anchor in the storm of Simon's emotions. "From now on, you will fish for people." Epilogue. Leaving the nets behind. The row back to the shore was a journey undertaken in stunned silence. The physical exertion of rowing two dangerously overloaded boats was nothing compared to the monumental weight of what had just transpired. When the hulls finally scraped against the gravel of Capernaum's beach, the crowd gasped at the impossible haul. Merchants would soon clamor for the catch, offering vast sums of silver. It was the greatest day of fishing in the history of their families. It was enough wealth to secure their futures, pay their debts, and live in comfort. But Simon Peter, Andrew, James, and John no longer cared about the fish. They looked at the overflowing boats, the culmination of everything they had ever worked for, and then they looked at the rabbi from Nazareth walking away up the shoreline. The choice was unspoken but absolute. They left the greatest catch of their lives rotting in the sun. They left their nets, their boats, their father Zebedee, and their entire way of life. They stepped away from the familiar shores of the Sea of Galilee to follow a man who had commanded the deep, stepping into a different kind of unknown, ready to cast a net that would eventually gather the world.